right-wing news. This video brought to you by Noble Gold.
Hello, fellow Americans. Welcome to Right Wing News. I'm your host, the voice of reason. And as promised, coming up just after this video is a very special guest, Dr. Jim Willie, the one and only editor of the Hat Trick Letter website, www.goldenjackass.com. Just a few of the things that we're going to talk about include, it was just kind of a coincidence that I happened to catch him for an interview the following business day after the failed Obamacare light vote. So we'll talk about effects that might have on the coming U.S. economy as well as markets, as well as signs that the retail apocalypse has already begun. That would be an understatement. It's well underway, and the effects that that's going to have on the economy and the markets moving forward. Why in God's name the Fed chose to raise rates when they did, when there's virtually no measurable economic metric that suggests that the economy is doing well enough for it to do so. We're also going to talk about why foreign countries are dumping U.S. treasuries like it's going out of style, which is further increasing rates and causing some turmoil in the bond markets. Dr. Willie also adds some insight on what's taking place within the deep state and our intelligence agencies, not to mention a few little deviations, so to speak, into what's happening with Pizzagate and how it relates to all of the above. So one of the last things that is covered in the interview is Dr. Willie just gives his advice of things that people should be doing to protect themselves, everyday people, as this unwinding is set to begin. And one of the things he encourages people to do is to at least consider, at the very least, converting some, if not all, of their 401ks into gold or precious metal. So, being as how Noble Gold is one of my sponsors, there will be plenty of links provided within the notes section, along with links to where you can subscribe to the Hat Trick Letter, and links to Dr. Willie's site as well in the notes section of this video. So please be sure to check out all of those. Again, for anybody interested in learning more about how to convert an existing 401k into gold or silver, I encourage you to check out my sponsor at Noble Gold. So with that, here it comes. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Right Wing News. I am your host, the voice of reason. And as promised earlier in the week, I've got a very special guest with us today. That is Dr. Jim Willie. He is the lead research dog and the editor at the Hat Trick newsletter at goldenjackass.com. If you want to know what's going on in the global economy today, the Hat Trick newsletter is absolutely one of those things that you just have to have in your arsenal of information. For those that are not familiar, there will be links provided in the notes section of this video. I can't encourage you enough to check out both the Hat Trick and get yourself a subscription. And with that, Dr. Willie, how you doing today?
I like to say that I'm doing strange. I know it sounds a little unorthodox, but these are really different and difficult, unusual times. I cannot say, oh, I'm doing fine, all's well. No, it's not all fine. It's not all well. And I'm trying to adapt to difficult conditions. I think like a lot of people. I told somebody recently, I don't know a single American friend, a single Canadian friend who's running a business or dealing with, a portfolio. Not a single one is having a smooth time. They're all dealing with difficulties. Every single one I know in business is dealing with not just conflicts, it's changing conditions, changing winds, altered platforms, lost business, unexpected costs, diverted channels of funding, supply chain messed up, clients slowly falling off. These are very difficult times. I don't know how anybody can just fly through smooth sailing. It's just not there.
It's funny, you said that it may sound a bit unorthodox at first, and I would submit to you, I think it's far more unorthodox from my perspective anyway, to talk to people that have no idea what's going on. I think they're the ones that really have a strange line of thinking, not those of us that are aware things are going on. And the other thing that kind of stuck out with what you said was, people that are handling portfolios, people that are handling businesses, and yes, those are certainly by necessity some of the more informed people, but also in the vast minority of people versus the uninformed masses that there's unfortunately have an awful lot of power. There's no IQ test or education test or being aware of current events test to vote and to influence the outcome of things that are happening in this country. So while the informed certainly seem concerned, what I fear more and what I try to focus my show towards is those that don't know, or more specifically, those that almost have willful blindness on, the Trumpettes, as I call them, that just believe that we have a president who can fix everything somehow because of his former business prowess, not realizing that there are 525 other power-crazed maniacs that need to get a swing at the plate before he even touches anything. So, no, I think you're right with the same folks, Dr. Willie. It's somewhat of a coincidence, I suppose, that we scheduled this a few weeks back, and it turns out to be the day after, or the business day after, the Obamacare vote, which some originally suggested, could send the markets into turmoil. So I figured that might be an interesting point to start our conversation with. If you had any particular take on how that went, or what your expectations are on that moving forward.
I think some people, maybe a lot of people, believe that the Obamacare repackaging and the vote toward that in the Congress was a failure for Trump because he gave a tepid endorsement to Ryan, and I could not disagree more. Donald Trump saw Obamacare as a failure. Trump did not have the political support in Congress to knock it down and to replace it with something more viable, or just plain remove it. So he allowed a burning Trojan horse to be adopted by Ryan and trotted out before the Congress where it failed. I don't think Ryan is an ally of Trump. I think Ryan is a neocon with a red coat, a red vest. Ryan is, well, maybe a blue vest. I'm not. You know what's really funny, Mike, is I don't even know whether whether Ryan is a Republican or Democrat, and it does not matter. I actually think he's a Democrat because he was, is he a Democrat? I don't know. What is he?
He goes by Republican, but you bring up a fair point. It kind of goes to the whole point. There is no right, there is no left, there is no Republican, there is no Democrat. There is liberty or there is tyranny, and there is no in between. And he clearly falls on the side of tyranny.
Okay, all right. So I'm glad you cleared it up, and it exposes a little bit of my political ignorance. But here is what is important regarding Ryan. He's a neocon.
That he is.
So he's a Democrat, blue-coated neocon. We don't have Republican and Democrat party. We have populist and neocon party. And the neocon has, regarding the U.S. public support, I would say it has like 20 to 30 or 35% support. The populists have the rest in a big majority, but the neocons control 3/4 of Congress.
And the money.
And the people have not figured this out. So Ryan is a neocon tool that Trump said, go on, go out there, put a few alterations on Obamacare, let that burning Trojan horse put a hole through the stage in Congress, and the loss will be of Ryan's position in the Congress. This is not a failure for Trump. This is a failure for Ryan and the neocons, who tried to put some kind of I hate that phrase lipstick on a pig, but they tried to put a better face on Obamacare with I'm not even sure what some of the alterations were, but the insurance companies hate it, and they're dropping it. So, the cost is rising, the coverage is falling, the premiums are huge, and the deductibles are just not workable. Okay, so people think that there might be a big stock market decline because of this. I don't think this is a trigger at all. The trigger for the stock market decline, if and when that comes, that'll be from the Federal Reserve and Wall Street working together to cut back on QE volume and S&P stock support. Has nothing to do with Obamacare. By the way, Obamacare, what is Obamacare? I mean, okay, the Affordable Health Care Act, fine. But what is it? First of all, it's an attempt to provide health care for the very poor. And unfortunately, it's not cheap, so it ought to lose the name affordable. Second of all, it requires a full financial statement by people, and that is a big goal for the U.S. government because they're trying to track down foreign accounts. They're trying to track down Americans who lie about foreign accounts. Okay, so that's a very important piece. Another element to it is with the national health care, it'll be a lot easier to force Americans to accept the implant in their upper left arm.
Oh, glad you brought that up. Excellent. Okay.
These are elements of the Health Care Act, and they don't have much to do with health care. The other thing is, Obama believes that big government, big corporations, and all this fascist tendency is the route toward the future and a successful path, and it's not. It's not at all. What we've had as an effect is perhaps the most profound and devastating slam against small business in a century, because companies little business don't want to achieve the 50-person employee mark, because then they would be forced to qualify and shove this thing down their workers' throats. And the U.S. government, being so ugly regarding the enforcement of Obamacare, decided that any little company that got bought out by a bigger company immediately qualifies under the big company status and must force down the Obamacare to the throats of their employees. So just consolidation of companies is working against it. What we've seen is the biggest slam against small business in a century. Enormous declines in new company formation, big declines in hiring by small business, and a devastation for perhaps the most important element to the U.S. economy growth stature, which is small business. So, is Obama a Democrat or a fascist? I think he was a fascist. I don't care. I don't care, Mike, that he had a blue coat on. I don't care. It's like they ought to change it from a blue coat to blue underwear, because the outer coat is the globalist fascist, and that is brown. So the effect of Obamacare repackaged rejection, nil on the stock market. Nil on Trump, in fact, a victory, because watch how Ryan is going to lose his spot, and maybe someone more favorable to the populist movement, as opposed to the brown coat fascist movement, will step in to replace Ryan. I don't like Ryan. I used to be a Democrat. I kind of liked the Republican stance of free enterprise and lower taxes, because I get sick and tired of the Democrats raising taxes, putting in projections for higher tax revenues that never happen. Mm-hmm. So if you reduce taxes, are you going to reduce tax revenue, you moron Democrats? No, it'll be the opposite, but with a time lag. So I'm in favor of lower taxes. The United States corporate tax structure is the highest in the world. You think if we lower it, we'll get lower tax revenue, you idiot Democrats?
No, of course it will go up.
It'll go up, but with a lag. We got to have the formation. We've got to have the reaction within the markets. And Democrats don't want to wait. They want the immediate effect.
But they'll take credit for it,
though.
They'll take credit for it when it does come in later on the lag. You know, and there's a Democrat in office. They'll be the first ones taking credit for the increase in revenue. They've been known to do such things.
Yeah, well, the Democrats also put blame on Bush, too, when the recession got more vicious in 2009, immediately within the Obama administration. Now, the phenomenon of blaming the past president is remarkable. And with all the attacks on Trump, they're trying to deflect the problems from 8 years of Obama bullshit and fascism and corruption and executive orders. And it's just not going to work because Trump's going to clean house. But I will say this regarding Trump, and I really don't want to get into a long list of things regarding Trump and politics and policy. Trump is going to clean the swamp as far as racketeering and pedophilia go. And pedophilia is a nice catch word, but think of it as much bigger than that. It's satanic rituals, devotion, child sacrifice, child and underage sex rings, and extortion of politicians, bankers, and judges, like the Supreme Court, who participate in parties with underage girls and cocaine on video. So their votes are taken by way of extortion. This is what the pedophilia is all about, and I believe it could turn out to be the largest story of the century, bigger than World War II, if it ever fully comes to light. Because Langley and the Mossad have been using several hundred agents to trap politicians, bankers, and judges, and some business people with these sex and drug parties that are videotaped in order to control the votes to be pro-Israel, pro-war, and pro-global fascist state agenda, which they call globalists. Whenever you hear the word globalist, add on the word fascist, global fascist. It's a better description. It's not a kind concept. New World Order is not more orderly. It's more brutal, without democracy or rights. But Donald Trump is not going to clean up the dollar and banking corruption, nor is he going to clean up much of any war and defense appropriation corruption. This is where the limitations of the swamp effect and its cleaning will end. In order to gain office, he had to make deals with the Goldman Sachs and Pentagon devils to protect against the Hillary vote fraud, to protect against the press network slams, and to win office in the White House. So he owes the bankers in the Pentagon. Watch how they try to create more conflict with China and Iran. It's not constructive. This is the flaw behind the Trump administration. And for practicality, Trump is going to have to continue with the dollar in its current status, even though he's got a few advisors who are in favor of the gold standard. We're going to get to that soon, but he needs the dollar in its current form in order to increase the deficits to fund his agenda toward first the infrastructure projects, which he calls a $1 trillion project, but also what he doesn't talk about much and needs to is reindustrializing the United States atop this new infrastructure. So we've got a lot of work coming.
Absolutely. That's an understatement. hopefully some of that reindustrialization could take place if he's able to somehow accomplish his repatriation of all the money that's overseas. We'll see how or if that comes to pass. You mentioned something else earlier, though, that as it related to the Obamacare thing, I tend to agree. The thing that Obamacare hurts the most is their small employers, whereas the stock market is your big boys, and that's hardly influenced by mom and pop money anymore. That's mainly institutional money that's driving that, and it's fake institutional money for that matter, highly inflated dollars, which gets to what's going on with the Fed. We constantly hear Janet Yellen during the last year saying that they were data dependent. They would wait until the data supported raising interest rates, and I for one can't see any measurable metric that points to the fact that our economy is doing any honest. Let me rephrase that. Any honest metric, right. Because 4.7 or whatever they're claiming unemployment is hardly qualifies. And now with this steady raise of interest rates, along with foreign nations beginning to dump U.S. treasuries, already causing bond rates to begin to rise, I don't see what. And here we're talking about too a Fed chair that halfway through 2008, I think the total 2008 Great Recession cost the U.S. economy roughly $14 trillion, somewhere thereabouts, and halfway through that, she was still refusing to admit we were in a recession. So that person is the same one that's telling us we're in a recovery and nothing to worry about. And now with raising rates, I'm just really not sure that this is going to move us in a direction that doesn't end very ugly. And I'm sure that you've got quite a bit of information as well as to say on her moves in the Fed with that regard.
When the Trump administration gained office with inauguration in mid-January, I thought that there were three very big threats to his entire agenda, to the mandate that he was given. I like the word mandate even though it wasn't a huge margin, but if you eliminate the vote fraud and maybe at 7 or 8 million fraudulent Hillary votes, I think his margin of victory was closer to 10%, maybe 8%. Which would have been a mandate like with Reagan in his second election. The three threats were the Fed would cut back on QE. The second would be interest rates. Price inflation would rise. All they need to do is properly report it. And the third would be some kind of an unusual U.S. dollar rejection at a global level, even with some globalists involved. Like, say, just for instance, the Rothschild central banks make a deal with China and Russia that they're going to refuse the dollar in trade, but the Western nations are going to adopt some kind of a gold-backed SDR out of the International Monetary Fund. And that'll be a centralized gold corruption for a new currency, the SDR bond, which is the IMF basket. Okay, so Janet Yellen proceeded to corrupt the economic data, and I just like focusing on two items, the GDP, economic growth, and the CPI price inflation.
There was growth?
Pardon me?
I'm being facetious. I said there was growth? Referring to the Obama years.
Well, that's why I want to focus on the two statistics. The GDP, what they do is they take the nominal economic growth. That means no adjustments for anything, just straight out take the sales for goods and services and products, etc. All goods and everything. And compare to a year ago. That's called the nominal growth. Then they reduce it by their official price inflation. But what if their price inflation is wrong by between 3 and 5 or 6%? Let's just, for argument's sake, say that it's 5% wrong. I mean, they report the CPI using all kinds of other gimmicked methods, substitutions, adjustments, And here's a very weird one. I don't want to get deep into it too. But they don't use an arithmetic mean. They don't add up A, B, and C and divide by 3. What they do is they multiply A, B, and C together, and then they take the cube root. It's called the geometric mean. And what it does is it greatly reduces any one or two elements that are big up moves. So if you've got a whole bunch of items that are between 2 and 4%, then you got 3 or 4 that are like 8 and 12%, the geometric mean will greatly reduce their influence in the overall mean. It's a trick from Robert Rubin, who must have been a pretty good math student. Okay, so if they lie by 5% on the CPI for the adjustment of the nominal economic growth, they're lying on the economic growth by that same amount. And what they say is we have 2% growth or 3% growth, subtract 5, and you've got minus 2 or minus 3% recession. They're calling inflation growth. Okay, so Janet Yellen relied on the job statistics, the job growth. That's the second one. I'm sorry. I said there were 2. There are actually 3. It's economic growth, which is integrally tied in with CPI. And the second one is the jobless rate. Okay, the jobless rate under Clinton was redefined. Again, another Robert Rubin trick. It's the state unemployment in jobless insurance. It's that rate. What percentage of people are collecting the state unemployment insurance? They're calling that the jobless rate. It's not. Because if you run out of weeks, you're still jobless. They just assume that you're discouraged. So you exit the job market and you're no longer jobless. So basically they're saying anyone who goes the 99 weeks becomes a vagrant and a bum who's no longer jobless. Okay, total nonsense. Janet Yellen, I believe, took globalist orders, banker cabal orders, to raise interest rates and to screw up the Trump administration. Next, watch for them to bring about a stock market decline. Trump is trying to reduce the dollar's high value. And I think while he does that from his offices in say, Goldman Sachs territory, he's going to encounter some resistance from the global fascist state, which runs the banker cabal. So we're going to have a battle over the dollar and the stock market, and you're already seeing the dollar take some small hits. It's under 100 now again, and I just got a note from a client who's a very helpful fellow in Florida. He says the U.S. dollar just printed 98.90. He calls a critical level 98.0. I tend to agree with him.
What's the lowest it's been in recent years? Do you happen to know, just out of curiosity?
I didn't hear your question. What?
I was just curious if you know what the lowest it's reached in recent years is, out of curiosity. I know it's not terribly relevant. I'm just curious.
No, I don't know.
Okay.
The important part is that the uptrend is interrupted and a downtrend begins. Because if that happens, you're going to see a lot more stress on the stock market. But here's what I think is going to happen. I think you're going to see the Wall Street banks realize that even with some phony money supplied by the Fed, they can't keep the stock market up. They can't keep the S&P, which is 500 stocks, wider, and the Dow Jones Industrial narrower. They can't keep the wide and narrow indexes up. So they're going to make a deal with the Fed. Okay, let's make some money on the downside. And you got to remember back to Robert Rubin. He gave away his tricks. Remember he resigned early in June of 2000, before the end of the second Clinton administration? He said he wanted to return to private life. No, he wanted to get out of the way for the tech telecom bust, which he wanted to make several $billions on in his private accounts by shorting the stock market because he kept raising the interest rate up to 6% going into June and then resigned. Okay, so these folks in Wall Street are experts in putting in leveraged S&P future short contracts. And as if that 20 to 30 to 1 leverage is not enough, they put in option puts on the S&P futures, which is double leverage. Call it leverage squared. They're experts in leverage. So I think we're going to see some very nasty declines in the stock market. It's going to scare the piss out of the U.S. public. That's what I think is coming. And as far as the economy goes, yeah, you're right, Mike. There are no indications at all. And when Janet Yellen had her press conference after the rate hike, she got embarrassed worse than any central bank head I've ever seen in my 30 to 40 years of observations. And that goes back to Arthur Burns. I've never seen a Fed head backtrack on a rate hike on the day of a rate hike, admitting that the data was a lot weaker than she presented in the official meeting and official press release. The press was all over like white on rice, saying, but wait a minute, you've got bankruptcies rising all over the place. You've got debt defaults. You've got the energy sector. You've got the car loan sector. And she said, yes, and we will be reviewing this. And she actually opened the door for a reversal of the rate hike. Okay, so that's how you get the dogs off your legs at the press conference. All you have to look at is Sears, Roebuck, Kmart, Payless. Even my old Staples announced another 200-some stores. When I was there, we went from 1996 to 2000. We went from 270 stores to 1,100. Okay, those were the heyday years, the great years. Now it's all decline, and my best buddy there left Staples a year and a half ago. And he went somewhere where there's a little bit of growth. Okay, the retail sector is going to hell. And I'd like to mention something regarding the strategy, the economic strategy that we've got. Not only are the Keynesians wrong on debt, which goes to saturated levels, Mike, they're wrong that consumption can drive and power an economy. It does not. All it does is liquidates capital, like home equity. After they liquidated a few years' worth of home equity capital, what happened to the housing market? What happened to the household wealth? It collapsed.
Kaboom.
So what you need instead is what Trump has been advocating: capital formation, infrastructure, new business creation, hiring, lower taxes, lighter regulations, and removal of Obamacare, which is a grand obstacle to small business. Okay, retail is not the solution nor the engine of any healthy economy. It is savings and business investment, which promotes hiring. You don't put money in people's pockets to spend and expect anything positive after 3 months. Remember the Obama economic stimulus.
Mm-hmm.
It was for his own green energy stocks, and it was to put money into his constituents' hands, consumers. It was a fleeting effect that had no positive anything on the U.S. economy for an effect. Nothing. Okay, let's move on. I get excited about really bad economics and bad policy and bad banking. Anyway, go ahead, let's move on.
I'm with you on that. It's hard not to get excited about it because it is so critical to what's happening right now, and so few people are aware of it. I suppose that's the portion of it that fires me up. So, one of the things that I'd like to cover a little bit here is, and I'm somewhat I call them the rabid Trump supporters, the ones that feel that he can do no wrong, that he can fix everything, forgetting the fact that there's 525 other power-crazed lunatics. But for the folks that think that everything's just going to be fine, we have seen this surge, which has people delusionally thinking that the U.S. economy is healthy and that it's getting better and that we're going to see a brighter day. And to anybody that's under the age of 70, I'm constantly saying things to my audience like they're unaware of what the planet Earth looks like without the dollar as the world reserve, and that usually kind of goes in one ear and out the other ear. And the reason for that is, and I tend to really pick on millennials an awful lot. It's not entirely their fault that academia has failed them so badly, but most Americans, and I would say all millennials, have no idea what being the world reserve means, and even more importantly, what losing that status is going to mean, and how losing that status happens. In other words, it's not a UN vote, all in favor of leaving the dollar. It's a process, and one that is well underway, and what that means for the future of the U.S. and our standard of living, and why people need to be paying attention to this, and if they're unwilling or I often say too, your understanding of what's coming is not a prerequisite to it coming. What is going to happen whether people understand it or not. It's best that they begin preparing for it while they still can, especially if they're one of the people that are blessed enough to have a paycheck still coming. So I'd like you to because all of that kind of relates to what the Fed is doing with the raising of rates and how other countries are dumping treasuries on the market. I mean, all that's somewhat tied together. So I'd love to get your take on some of that.
Okay. First of all, I agree with you completely. Anyone under 70 has no idea what the dollar reserve status means or what it would be without the dollar in its current status. Okay. Let's have a preliminary here. I like to define what the dollar's global currency reserve status actually means. Okay? It's two things, and they're very important. I've had similar conversations with people about, first of all, it's much more basic, Mike, the ignorance. First of all, I say, are you aware that the dollar is used outside the United States for trade and banking purposes? And they say, no. What do you mean? And I say, well, a contract between, say, India and Saudi Arabia for something or other like an information technology placement. They would do it in dollars. You buy oil in China from, say, Iran, they pay in dollars. That's not true anymore, but and they don't know that. They don't know that. I thought it was the U.S. government's, the U.S. economy's currency. Well, it is, but I said you're not aware of its foreign usage. No. Then I say that you're not aware of its foreign threat and risk. No, the dollar's doing great. They mentioned the dollar index. And Dominicans, I know a couple Dominicans, they say, well, the dollar is up like 40% versus our Dominican peso, and it's causing tremendous economic problems inside the Dominican nation. Okay, so what is the global currency reserve? What does it mean? First, it means that banks across the world use U.S. Treasury bonds as their reserve asset for their core. Just think of South Korea, for instance. They might have over $100 billion in their banking system, core reserve deposit foundation. So the foundation for banking systems is the dollar in the form of debt. Do you see anything upside down with that? You cannot have debt as an asset to underpin an entire nation's banking system. But that's what we have.
Or the world's, for that matter.
Pardon me?
Or the world's banking system, more or less, for that matter.
That's what I'm saying. The world banking, I'm exactly saying that. I gave Korea as an example of the entire global banking system. Okay, the second definition for global currency reserve is that trade payments and contract settlements, it's not just trade, it's not just oil shipments and container vessels. It's a lot more than that. It's international consulting. It's IT, information technology, computer system, patent work, patent payment, copyright payment, intellectual property payments. Lots and lots of different things that are non-tangible. They're done in the dollar also. Okay, so if the dollar loses its global reserve status, then banks are going to sell treasury bonds to buy gold or something sustainable, and foreign countries that do trade are not going to use treasury bills anymore. I think they're very likely to start using the gold trade note, which is beginning to come into view. They might, in an interim, use Chinese RMB currency, which I believe will become the first gold-backed currency to disrupt the dollar. And then you're going to have a dual universe, the West using the dollar, the East using the RMB, including Russia, and probably most of Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia needs to be considered as a unique entity because it's Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, Singapore, and a whole lot of individual, smaller, very productive nations that have surpluses, not deficits. Okay, if the U.S. loses the global currency reserve status for the dollar, it means that the United States, in order to guarantee import supply, is going to have to come up with a different currency. This is where the crisis risk lies. This is where the pulling the rug out has a huge risk, because the United States is running a $550 billion annual trade deficit, and whatever new currency we have will be under the risk of severe devaluation on a regular and frequent basis, which will cause a currency crisis and price inflation inside the United States, and I guarantee you, a lot of rioting and chaos. So, the U.S. public does not understand what the reserve status means for the dollar. And you're exactly right. They don't have to understand it to see that the price inflation for food, for half of what we bring in, half of the food in the supermarkets is now imported. When I was a little kid, it was 90% domestic. Now it's over 50% imported. Okay, those prices will rise. We import oil over 50%. Now forget all the shale oil story. We still import over 50%. Prices will rise. Toyota cars will rise. The smartphones from Samsung, prices will rise. The Apple iPhones, iPads, made in China and elsewhere in the Southeast, again, Southeast Asia, will rise in price. And there will be rioting in the streets. Okay, so that's, okay, and the people over 70, I hate to say it, but, I do occasionally talk with people over 70, and they say, we'll never go back to where we were with legitimate currency. Well, they say that the dollar will find a way to continue, and I don't tend to agree with it. I tend not to agree with them. I think we're going to be moving toward alternatives to the dollar, barter systems like between Russia and China, it's almost barter, but the big barter example is China and Iran. They set up a huge account, a kitty, and you got credits and debits against it, and it's nearly balanced because China's importing a lot of oil and gas from Iran, and Iran is buying a lot of Chinese-made goods, and they're going to be buying a lot more Chinese-made cars. You're going to see the arrival of Chinese cars in the next few years. It's already evident here in Costa Rica. There are 2 or 3 types. I believe the Geely is one type. There are 2 or 3 others. There's a vendor in Curitiba, just a couple miles east of town here. And I hit it when I biked toward a very nice shop that reminds me a lot of the format of Home Depot. But instead of orange, they've got a blue color. It's called EPA. But right next to that is a Chinese car dealer. So that's where I go to take a look. You know, very brief look. What are the brands for the Chinese cars? And you see them occasionally in the malls, and they'll trot in 3 or 4 and have a little promotion for a week, just information promotion, and hand out leaflets. And sometimes they have some very cute young ladies handing out the brochures. So I find myself in a much more inquisitive mood when they arrive with my list of questions. But that's a story for another day. Okay, under 70, they've never really known anything because the dollar became the fiat currency in 1971, which was 46 years ago. The record up to the dollar for a global currency reserve, a global currency, dominant entity without a gold backing was 40 years. maybe 41 years. But anyway, we're making record territory. And that's why in 2004, when I started the Hat Trick Letter, I made a forecast as part of a seminal list of items that would track the legacy for the success of the Hat Trick Letter. I said eventually, down the road, and I got mockery. I laugh at mockery. Honestly, Mike, I laugh at my mockery. The forecast was eventually the dollar was going to be defended by war. And sanctions are a form of financial war. And Ukraine and Syria are actual war. And it's not just there, it's in Djibouti too. We have a lot of casualties, not thousands, but we have a few hundred casualties from Djibouti. That's on the horn of the Sea of Aden, that works toward the Suez Canal. That's a rather important waterway. Well, on the African side is Djibouti. On the other side is Yemen. Is there a war in Yemen?
Absolutely.
And is the war without stated motive? We get a nonsense, farcical motive of factional fighting between the Saudis and other Muslims. Right. They're trying to steal the Yemeni oil reserves, and they're trying to take control on the other side of Djibouti on the Gulf of Aden. Very ugly, ugly times. Every war we have, whether it's Yemen, Syria, or Ukraine, has a very big ulterior hidden motive of economics and opposition to the dollar. All right, let's move on.
So if that trade, because of how large our trade deficit is, again, it's a number kind of like our cumulative national debt that kind of goes in one ear and out the other ear with folks, because they'll say to me, I heard the world was coming to an end when we were at $17 trillion in debt, and here we are at 20, and my life is pretty much the same, other than groceries going up a couple of dollars. I get kind of the same thing when I try to talk to people about the trade deficit. How much, if we were just talking to Joe and Sally Q Public, can we tell them that they should be prepared for and I realize it's not an exact science, but how much should they be prepared for their lifestyle to change as this continuation of the dollar's demise goes on? Well, is it something that will be felt by every American, just the elites? Is Joe and Q Sally Public going to feel that in their families on a regular basis? How bad should we expect that to be?
I think they're going to see it in 3 profound areas. The first will be in prices, because the dollar in its current form just cannot continue. I put out an article today about the top 10 risks to the U.S. dollar, and they're all over the place. The risks are amazing. Let me run down quickly what these risks are, okay? Can you bear with me as I read, not long descriptions, but just 10 titles of what the risks are? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay, because this addresses the question of what people need to prepare for. It's really a rise in prices, perhaps some severe declines in their bank account and stock accounts, and the supply chain disruptions. Okay, but here are the risks, because these are all real and a lot of people are not very familiar with them. That's why I try to put out, kind of educational article. Clients of mine, friends of mine say, Jimmy, you got a didactic manner about you. Okay, I'm still a little bit of a professor, and I like that. I like to teach. I like to explain things, and it's not easy explaining some of these complex concepts. But here are the 10 big threats to the U.S. dollar. The U.S. Fed, in its QE bond purchase program, is really hyperinflation to monetize the U.S. government debt. No nation has ever survived that. Number 2, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB. It threatens the IMF and the World Bank. So the U.S. dollar global banking offices to make vassal states out of any country that wants a big loan, that's going away. Number 3, it's a Chinese-run organization, by the way. Number 3, cross-border interbank payment system called CIPS or CHIPS. It's a competitor run by China for the SWIFT bank transaction method, standard, that whole mechanism and system. So what we've been using as a financial war weapon of sanctions by means of the SWIFT blockage for bank transactions, that's going away. Number 4, China and Russia energy trade is now completely outside the dollar. So you have China in the number 1 importer of oil and Russia in the number 1 exporter of oil, no longer using the dollar. That's a threat to the dollar. Number 5, refusal to accept U.S. Treasury bills in trade payment. It's already started. I mentioned Iran and China are using a barter system, so they're not using Treasury bills in trade. There are other countries that are setting up barter systems, but I think we're going to get a very big event. I thought it was going to happen sometime at the end of last year. It just keeps getting delayed and delayed. I'm sure there are a lot of threats. But the Saudis eventually are going to accept RMB, Chinese currency, for oil payments. It's going to open the door for all of Asia, all Southeast Asia, the Pacific Rim, Pac Rim. They're going to all start taking, they're all going to start paying RMB for oil out of not just Saudi Arabia, but other Gulf monarchies. Okay, that's a big threat to the dollar. Number 6, the Ukraine war to obstruct Russian trade and supply. Well, it didn't really work. The workarounds are going through Turkey. And the motivation from the war was for Russia and China to join at the hip. And that's why you're seeing the One Belt, One Road, the Eurasian Trade Zone, what they call the Eurasian Economic Union. I don't like that name because another EEU. Give me a break. We already got EU as United States in Spanish. It's Estados Unidos. EU is French for United States. It's États-Unis. But now there's European Union, another EU. We don't need another Eurasian Union, EU. Okay, so number 7, the Syrian war to obstruct Iranian energy supply. Okay, it's not going to obstruct jack shit. The U.S. abandoned Iraq after the Shiites took control of the parliament. Now the Shiites are working more closely with Iran. The pipeline is going to go through northeast Iraq. It's going to end up through Syria eventually. So the United States wants to create an endless war in Syria using its hidden ISIS, what do you call it? Proxy. Good. I was going to say coalition. Proxy coalition. If they have endless war in Syria, the Iran gas pipeline will not be built. That's the motive. That's the motive for the war. Wake up, people. Number 8, the theft of Saudi U.S. bond holdings in the U.S. Department of Treasury. It's called the Exchange Stabilization Fund. Now, maybe the Saudis agreed to gradually contribute $3 trillion of savings. Do some math, people. 40 years of Saudi oil surpluses do not add up to what's on the official tick report. There's another 3 to 5 trillion in there, and I think the U.S. is going to steal all of it. Number 9, the Gulf Arab oil payments in RMB terms. Okay, I already mentioned that, kind of an offshoot of a previous point. And number 10, the economic implosion with the credit market. The debt market, the treasury bonds are starting to show some cracks. We've had a move up in interest rates, not just from the Trump effect. We started seeing that before Trump. Don't put that all on Trump. It was cracks of a natural nature in the treasury bond market. Okay, so I think we're going to see a continuation of that. And now you're actually having the Fed raising interest rates, which is, we're actually seeing now, this is very profound, very interesting, full of intrigue, and difficult to both monitor and comprehend. But when the Fed raised interest rates, normally the dollar would strengthen, and it did not. Normally the treasury bonds would strengthen, and they did not. So the interpretation was, by the smart money, that the Fed was probably sabotaging their own bond market and the economy on which they sit. But to get back to your main question, the threat for the people who were, bystanders and observers and active participants, watch the effect in prices, watch the effect in bank problems that result. I'm hearing stories after stories. It's not the bail-in. Okay, the bail-in is going to be the threat to the smaller people, maybe mid-sized people who have over $100,000 accounts. Okay, if you've got a $280,000 account, then you're going to be at risk. Now, clearly, you're not dealing with a $1 billion account. You're not dealing with $800 million, $250 million account. That's where the action is right now. Banks are blocking withdrawals of legitimate holders of $1 billion accounts and fractions of a billion, like 2/3 of a billion. They're blocking withdrawals. And they're doing so, I don't want to get into it all right now, but they're blocking. They've got their reasons, they've got their little ploys, they're very clever, and you can read about some of it in the Hat-Trick Letter. Next step is some bank failures and bail-ins, and people are going to lose accounts over 100,000. They might lose 35% of all accounts. I don't know. I'm not in charge. Okay, the second thing is stock accounts. There's just no way we're going to lose the dollar as global reserve and the stock market continues to be elevated. No way. And when you've got Wall Street with their ample experience and past precedent for profiting on the decline, you're going to see a decline. They're going to engineer it, and they're going to profit and exploit it, and they're going to blame the Russians. and the mindless masses are going to buy it. Okay, the third thing is supply chain network. Remember I said the dollar is the universal item in trade payment. That includes the supply chain, not just for food, but for hardware, for car parts, you name it. Okay, that's the international standard lubricant for supplying the whole inventory system in the U.S. economy. It's at risk now. So look for, I point to two major areas where it's going to inflame human emotions inside the U.S. economy. It's the supermarkets for food and gas stations for gasoline and diesel. They're going to erupt. You're going to have riots in Walmart. You're going to have exploding gas stations. I'm not advocating it. I'm just expecting it. I'm not a bad person for seeing this coming in the future when it will be ugly. Very ugly.
Amen to that.
Let's move on. So thanks for giving me the time to mention the $10 risks. I just put out a public article. You can find it already on goldseek.com. And almost all my articles appear on goldeagle.com, gold-eagle.com. Those are the two major online magazines that post my work. And there's some more, and I'm grateful to them all.
I'll be sure to make sure I leave a link to that included with this video so that everybody can check that out for sure, in addition to the link to your website. I wanted to ask you, is there anything else that you wanted to cover before we part? If there was anything urgent that you knew of, or things that you may want to make, again, my audience, I tend to try to focus on educate, like you mentioned, teaching people, the common everyday people that just kind of walk around with their blinders. Anything else that we may be able to offer them that would suggest to them it might be a good idea to begin preparing for a rainy day if you haven't already?
Okay, the first thing I would advise, these are final comments.
Sure.
Protect your life savings. This is kind of like a lost concept. I find that too many Americans don't know what inflation is. They don't know what capital formation is. They don't know what fascism is. They don't know what a lot of things are because we've kind of been operating for 30 years in a la-la land. But most of Americans' life savings are stored in paper assets like stocks, mutual funds, bonds, preferred stocks, bank CDs. These are all paper assets. They're all at risk because the paper system gradually is imploding, and the platforms supporting this system are imploding. And it's the dollar risk that is behind the risk for these paper assets. These paper assets are all propped up by the Fed and the Wall Street banks so that the people don't wake up. Well, I think it makes sense to sell them while they're high and propped up, and to buy gold and silver, coins and bars, not the exchange-traded funds, because those are corrupt Wall Street instruments. Buy gold and silver, coins and bars, because they're suppressed in price by the same architects, the Fed and the Wall Street banks. They're using a lot of corrupt methods. And just a single statistic, it's alarming. For every gold ounce held in the bullion banks and in official places like COMEX and London repositories, for every gold ounce, there are over 300 claims. Can you imagine what the price of housing would be if 300 people laid claim to the same property title? Okay, so we're going to see in the solution the gold standard, gold currencies, gold trade notes for trade payments. And it's going to be a gold-centered system, and Bitcoin might have a role in that. So people better be very careful about their life savings tied up in paper assets and start making some big conversions. And you can actually convert 401ks and IRAs. I think maybe IRAs. I think you can convert the structured IRAs into a gold account. You can do that. It's legal. And send me an email. I'll direct you to Will Lair at Perpetual Assets. Okay, the other 2 points that are very important are that CNN is basically a neocon political propaganda news network. It's no longer impartial news. I'm amazed when I watch standard television shows like the Steve Corbett night show, that replaced Johnny Carson and Dave Letterman. Mm-hmm. They come out with open political statements against Trump on their nightly talk shows. They bring on politicians, they bring on ex-figures, and it's some of the most nonsensical crap you'd ever want to see. CNN hired, with phony press badges, people from both the Hillary campaign offices and the Clinton Foundation. False press badges. I want to see CNN put out of business. I want to see them shut down and lose their license to broadcast. Okay, this is moving step by step in that direction. The third and final major point is that Trump, the first person to my knowledge, okay, they've always been the neocon, trilateral commission, globalist in the background like Kissinger and Brzezinski. They've always been there. Those are like the father figures for fascism. That's what I call them. Okay, but Trump is the first one that I know of to create a phony front to present to the U.S. Congress for key cabinet posts that pertain to security, intelligence, and maybe finance. We saw Flynn booted for National Security Advisor. Okay, that's not the NSA. It's not the National Security Agency. The NSA is separate from the National Security Advisor, which sits over a dozen or more, like 15 different intelligence agencies, security agencies. What I'm hearing is that Flynn was not fired. All he was transferred. He's got a key intelligence post that's not an official cabinet position. He's in charge of the Office of Strategic Intelligence, which oversees 13,000 private security agencies operating in the United States, like, say, for a big pharma company or Goldman Sachs. I guarantee you, J.P. Morgan has a private security agency. It protects their shipments of gold, protects their shipments of bonds, and protects their shipments of heroin. Heroin packets for overnight bank reserves usage. Heroin packs side by side with treasury bonds and some gold bars. Okay, so Flynn's objective, according to Cato, who is a U.S. government source of mine, Flynn's job now is to oversee these private security agencies, watch all the different NGO, non-government organizations, all the NGOs who are operating on U.S. soil as political action groups against the Trump administration that have a chief manager named Obama, that are mostly funded by George Soros, who's slowly acquiring a terrorist status label. So, very interesting time. The shadow government also includes, say, the shadow cabinet also includes, say, the defense secretary. Okay, we had a guy named McMasters recently put into the Post, and he went before Congress and said everything the neocons wanted to hear. I guarantee you, McMasters has very little authority in setting Pentagon policy. He's the defense secretary. He's the prop put before the Congress to make the neocons accept the Trump policy. Meanwhile, the shadow defense secretary in the shadow Trump cabinet will be making actual military policy. So when we make a maneuver, say in Syria, it might be done by the prop in order to fail. This is very complex. It's like a hidden chessboard. Very complex. And my curiosity right now is whether Mnuchin, who's Secretary of Treasury, whether he is a false prop, and whether actual banking and finance policy is being done in the Trump administration by other figures. I asked a key question to Cato, who's paying the shadow cabinet? And Cato said to me something very sly with a smile, as much as to say, good question, I'm not going to answer that, because you'll go ahead and blab it on your newsletter. I said, yeah, I probably would. And he's never said to me, Cato has never said to me, I'll tell you, but you have to keep it under your shirt. He's never done that with me. The voice frequently, I would say 10% of what the voice tells me is, well, in red lettering at the end of the email messages, this is not for distribution. This is not for inclusion in the newsletter. This is not to go any further. This is for our eyes only. Okay, very well understood, Mr. Boyce. But Cato doesn't do that. He's a little different. He's a little more careful. But he actually had a conversation with me last week regarding the tricks of the bankers. And he, for the first time, I guess I'm contradicting myself. For the first time, Cato said to me, you know, Jim, be careful with that information. And I'll be giving you more as it develops on bank tricks, bank obstructions. But he said, you don't need to worry about it because you don't have a $330 million account that they want to steal. If your hat trick letter produces a nice, ripe 27 grand in savings, well, that's fine. They're not interested in that. There's actually a FATCA rule that I just learned about that they're not even interested in accounts that are under $200,000 in their average daily balance. They don't care. They're too small. They're looking for the big money. If you're trying to track down $20 trillion of U.S. citizen and company money abroad, out of the country, overseas, in foreign banks, 20 trillion, you're not going to waste your time with a $27,000 bank account. You're going to be looking at the 200 million, 500 million, 1.6 billion. You're going to be looking at them. And that's where the tricks are, and I'm not going to talk about the tricks.
Okay, well, folks, everybody, Dr. Willie just did everybody a huge favor by covering some of the things that people don't know, that they're not familiar with, and things that they can do to better protect themselves. As I am constantly saying at the conclusion of most of my videos, he who controls the information controls. There's a reason you're not being told most of this. And now you've been given a ton of information by Dr. Willie. I would highly suggest adding the hat trick letter to your arsenal of information, again, because he who controls the information controls. Don't be led around by these people. For more on the shadow government, be sure to tune in to Right Wing News. There will be links to not just Dr. Willie's website, goldenjackass.com. There will also be a link to subscribe to the hat trick letter located within the notes of this particular video. So, as I say, he who controls it controls. Now it is incumbent upon you to do your part, which means to share. Share everywhere. Share on social media, share with friends, share with family. That's the only way that we're going to get more people informed. So I'd like to thank Dr. Willie for joining us once again, and look forward to a future conversation.
Well, thanks for having me on, Mike, and I encourage people to go to www.goldenjackass.com, bounce around the free area, sign up for the newsletter. There are 2 monthly reports. One's called the Global Money Report. The other one's called the Gold and Currency Report. And as a final little tidbit to throw out there, I believe CNN is not reporting on the over 1,500 pedophile arrests. By that I include child murder and sex slavery. 1,500 arrests are not on CNN, and I'll give you a possible reason. The executives of CNN are part of the sex ring. That's how dirty and ugly it is. I think Zucker is part of it all.
Very interesting note to close on. Folks, you'll find a lot of information about the pedophile rings in videos located at Right Wing News, so please check that out. Couldn't agree with Dr. Willie more on all of the above. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Willie, and look forward to our next conversation.
Okay, thanks for having me on.
Take care.